ever get that feeling? Like there's this part of you that almost wants you to mess up, to sabotage your own success, you know?
It's like a gremlin whispering bad advice in your ear.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, those hidden forces that shape our actions, based on Robert Greene's The Laws of Human Nature.
Oh, Greene doesn't shy away from the dark stuff. He calls it the stranger within,
Right.
right? That impulsive side that can really trip us up,
Yeah.
especially now with everyone glued to their screens.
It's like we live in this world where everyone says they want to be rational, but then we make decisions based on gut feeling. Or let's be honest, a tweet that got under our skin.
Totally. It's like we're hardwired for these emotional responses, and social media just pours gasoline on the fire,
Yeah.
you know? Greene's point is that this is how we end up getting manipulated or caught up in the frenzy of the crowd.
It's that pack mentality, right?
Exactly. Even if it goes against our own best interests.
So how do we actually break free from that? How do we outsmart the manipulators and actually use this knowledge to our advantage? Because green stuff is fascinating, but it can be a little unnerving too, right?
I know what you mean. It's like he's giving us the cheat codes to human behavior.
Yes.
But the real takeaway is that he doesn't want us to become master manipulators ourselves. It's about becoming aware.
Those are conscious.
Right, like actors who understand the roles they're playing. And he gives us like 3 main tools for that. First, we can learn to spot those manipulative types before they do too much damage.
Okay, damage control. I like it. What's the second tool?
So instead of trying to win every argument, Greene talks about influencing others by appealing to their deeper needs.
So it's not about winning the argument, but winning them over, right?
You got it.
Okay, that's fascinating. What about the third tool?
This one's all about nonverbal communication.
Oh, body language and all that?
Exactly. It's like learning to read between the lines.
Becoming a human lie detector?
Well, maybe not that good, but definitely picking up on those subtle cues.
That makes sense. But where does empathy fit into this whole thing? Because Greene can sound a little ruthless sometimes.
You're right, he can. But his version of empathy isn't about being nice. It's about understanding people's motivations, but using that knowledge strategically. It's about, like, think of that Athenian general, Pericles.
Pericles, the guy who basically convinced Athens to think long-term during the Peloponnesian War. Didn't they end up losing, though?
Eventually, yeah. But he kept them in the game for way longer than anyone thought possible. And he did it by being incredibly shrewd.
So what's the Pericles takeaway here?
Pericles knew the Athenians,
Yeah.
right? He understood they were driven by these big emotions, fear, ambition, all of that. So instead of just forcing his strategy on them, he framed it in a way that appealed to their desires.
Clever.
He basically made it about Athenian glory and dominance, even though it was really about playing the long game.
So it's about understanding not just what people want, but why they want it, right?
Got it.
That's a powerful lesson. But let's be honest, sometimes we make decisions that seem downright irrational, especially when you throw money into the equation.
You're talking about high-grade irrationality. Greene uses the 2008 housing crisis as an example. Even seasoned investors got caught up in that frenzy.
Because they thought they could get rich quick.
Exactly. The promise of easy money blinded them to the warning signs.
Yeah, I can see how that happens. But what's the psychology behind that? Why do we act against our own best interests, even when we know better?
Here's the thing. Our emotions and our rational minds, they don't always play by the same rules. It's almost like that stranger within Greene was talking about, is battling it out with your logical side.
And sometimes the stranger wins.
Sadly, yes. But the good news is, simply being aware of this internal struggle is a huge step towards regaining control.
So awareness is key. But I feel like we all know people who seem permanently stuck in that emotional overdrive. Which kind of brings us to a topic that's everywhere these days, narcissism. Have you noticed how many selfies people post online? You'd think they were the only ones who mattered.
It's true. And Greene actually talks about this. He calls it, let me get this right, deep narcissism. And it's not just vanity. It's like this total lack of empathy, a belief that the world actually revolves around them.
So how do you spot these deep narcissists? And more importantly, how do you avoid getting sucked into their orbit?
Well, Greene uses Howard Hughes as a cautionary tale. The guy who was brilliant, obviously, but kind of went off the deep end.
Right, right. Didn't he end up a recluse?
Exactly. Greene's point is that unchecked ego, even with all the talent in the world, it can really lead you down a dark path. So Hughes is like the ultimate cautionary tale.
Wow. Okay, so even with all the success in the world, deep narcissists end up isolated and unhappy.
It's like a hollow victory in a way.
It really is. But knowing this, is there a way to actually use this knowledge for good? To influence others ethically?
I think Greene would say yes.
Huh.
He argues that real influence comes from understanding what people desire, even the desires they aren't fully aware of. He calls it manufactured desire, if I'm remembering that right.
Manufactured desire. Okay, now you have to explain that one. It sounds like we're getting into Inception territory here.
It's not as trippy as it sounds. Think of someone like Coco Chanel. She didn't just create clothes. She tapped into this deep desire women had for freedom, for self-expression.
Okay, I can see that.
Right. So that's like manufactured desire in action.
Hmm.
Identifying a yearning that's already there and then providing a way to fulfill it.
So it's less about manipulation and more about understanding the deeper motivations behind our choices. That makes sense. But Greene also gets into some pretty intense stuff with his concept of the shadow. And honestly, that one makes me a little nervous. What is that all about?
Yeah, the shadow, it's not about being negative. It's about facing those parts of ourselves that we usually keep hidden. Greene argues that if we just ignore those darker impulses, it only gives them more power. Like he uses Stalin as an example, which is a little extreme.
Talk about a chilling example. I mean, I hope I don't have any dictators hiding in my subconscious, but seriously, how do we even begin to deal with our shadow without totally freaking out?
Well, Greene suggests looking for what he calls contradictory behavior. Basically, those moments when our actions don't really match up with how we see ourselves. Like, have you ever noticed how sometimes people who are over the top nice, it can actually be a sign of insecurity?
Whoa. You just blew my mind.
It's the shadow in action.
So it's about being more self-aware and also paying attention to those little disconnects between someone's words and their actions.
Exactly. It's about being honest about our own shadow impulses and learning to recognize them in others too. And that awareness, that's how we start to gain control instead of letting those impulses control us.
So we're not choosing to be ruled by them. We're like the conductor of our own orchestra.
I like that. It's a much better image than being, at the mercy of our darker impulses.
For sure. But sometimes it's hard to stay in that conductor role, especially with all the comparison that happens online. It's so easy to fall into that grass is greener trap.
Oh, Greene talks about that too. He says it's a recipe for unhappiness. We start focusing on what other people have, and we forget about our own strengths.
It's hard when you're constantly bombarded with images of everyone else's highlight reels.
I know. Greene uses Anton Chekhov as an example, the writer. He faced poverty, illness, a lot of challenges, but he found joy in the writing itself.
He focused on the craft.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that gave him a sense of purpose. So it's about finding meaning in the journey, not just chasing some finish line that always seems out of reach.
That's such an important reminder. But what about the influence of the people around us? I have to imagine it's got to be harder to stay true to yourself when you're surrounded by, negativity or groupthink.
You're right. This is another key thing Greene talks about. He says our thinking actually shifts when we're part of a group. He uses the example of the South Sea bubble. Remember that?
Yeah.
Where basically everyone got swept up in this investing frenzy, and it led to this huge crash.
It's like history repeating itself.
Totally. And Greene's point is that it's not just history. It's hardwired into us, back to those tribal instincts we were talking about.
It's like we crave belonging so much that we're willing to silence our own better judgment.
It's a tough balance. But Greene says the key is to become, and I'm using his words here, a more conscious social actor.
So being present and aware of the group's energy, but not letting it completely sweep us away.
Exactly. Which, again, comes back to self-awareness. If we can master that, then we can work with groups, cooperate, all of that, but without losing our own individuality.
So it sounds like self-awareness is the common thread that runs through all of Greene's work. It's like the foundation for everything else, whether it's managing our shadow side, navigating group dynamics, you name it.
You got it. You can't really get around it. Self-awareness is the bedrock of his whole philosophy, really. Because by understanding ourselves, our motivations, our triggers, all of it, we actually gain the power to make more conscious choices and ultimately to live more fulfilling lives.
So we've talked about self-awareness, the shadow self, group dynamics, but where does authority fit into all of this? It feels like people have such a complicated relationship with authority figures.
It's definitely ingrained in us, right? Like from childhood even.
We want someone to tell us what to do, but we also don't want to be controlled.
Exactly. And Greene talks about how this goes way back even to our tribal origins. We crave that guidance, but we also want autonomy.
It's a tough balance. So what happens when that balance gets out of whack?
Well, Greene actually uses the French Revolution as an example. When the old order crumbled, it wasn't exactly a recipe for utopia,
Things got a little chaotic, to say the least.
put it mildly. And Greene uses that to show how a world without any authority can be just as scary as one with too much.
So it's not about abolishing authority altogether. It's about understanding its role and maybe demanding better leaders while we're at it.
Exactly. Greene's point is that true authority isn't about force. It's about inspiring trust, respect. He uses Queen Elizabeth I as an example, which pretty interesting choice, right?
Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, what made her such a good leader in Greene's view?
Well, she really understood image. Despite all the threats she faced, she projected this aura of strength, and she knew how to inspire her allies, intimidate her enemies.
Sounds like she was a master strategist.
Oh, totally. Navigating court life, that was no joke. But she handled it.
It makes those palace intrigue shows look like a walk in the park. So, all this talk about strategy, I have to ask, what about those times when our less, shall we say, refined instincts take over? Greene does spend a lot of time on how destructive aggression can be.
He does. But he also argues that aggression in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's energy. And like any energy, it can be channeled.
Okay, so like instead of trying to suppress it, we need to figure out how to use it constructively.
Right. It can fuel ambition, problem solving, even creativity
Yeah.
if you channel it the right way.
Yeah.
He talks about Georges Danton, who was a major player in the French Revolution.
Didn't Danton eventually have second thoughts about the whole revolution thing?
Yeah, later on, it seemed like he regretted the violence, the bloodshed. And Greene uses that to make a point about how important it is to direct our aggression productively.
To make sure it's actually serving us. So how do we find that balance where we can embrace ambition but not become, tyrants?
Greene would probably say it all comes back to self-awareness, understanding our tendencies, our triggers.
So we can make conscious choices instead of just reacting. So after this deep dive into, well, us, what's the biggest takeaway here? Is Greene saying we're all just doomed to repeat these patterns of manipulation, self-sabotage, chasing power?
Not at all. If anything, I think his message is really empowering. He's saying that understanding these forces within us, that's how we become more conscious, more in control of our lives.
It's not about erasing our flaws, it's about understanding how they work.
Yes. And then we can use that knowledge to make better choices.
So understanding human nature is the key to, well, everything. Our relationships, our careers, everything.
It's a lifelong process for sure. And there are no easy answers.
No magic bullets.
Definitely not. But like Greene says, it's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. It's about understanding ourselves and, in turn, understanding the world around us a little better.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Hopefully, it's given you a lot to think about on your own journey of self-discovery. Until next time, thanks for listening.